Hola from Ajijic, Mexico, on the shores of Lake Chapala in the state of Jalisco. It's near Guadalajara, which is the second largest city in Mexico, behind Mexico City. Well, I'm Bob Henderson. I am the Nomad Dad for the Nomad Capitalist, and I'm going to talk today about whether or not I think it'd be a good idea to start a business in the United States. Oh, by the way, yes, I wanted to go back and talk again. I'm, for purposes of this video as the Nomad Dad, I'm Bob Henderson. But as I've indicated to you in a previous video or two, some of my friends now know me as Winston Smith. And Winston Smith, in case you have to think about it, it sounds like a good stage name. Winston Smith is the main character in Orwell's 1984, and Winston works at the Ministry of Truth. And I just kind of thought about how things were going here in the early 2020s and the Ministry of Truth, and the fact that all our heritages are being brushed aside, swept away. So I thought, you know, in early 2021, I got to thinking, well, maybe I ought to just sarcastically, I ought to be Winston Smith. It's caught on with a few of my friends. So if you want to refer to me as Winston Smith, I'll know who you're talking about. So one of the topics that was suggested to me by Andrew's social media and video staff in Tbilisi, Georgia, was, do I think it makes sense to start a business in America today? And I would say in a qualified way, well, yes. But I think it depends on what kind of business it is. You know, amazingly, one of the toughest businesses you could be in would be any kind of service business, but particularly a restaurant or a bar. And you saw what happened during the pandemic. I mean, they put you out of business. The government did, essentially. And, you know, what I never thought would happen is where was the rule of law, particularly contract law, with regard to owners of real estate? I mean, this is starting a business, right? It's no question about it. And roughly half of the landlords in America are not BlackRock, who's buying more and more property. It is not big corporate entities. It's what we would call a ma and pop business, just simple people. Now, they may be reasonably well-to-do, and some of them are just regular folk who are using this either to augment their income, or maybe in later years using it to be part of their retirement portfolio. But nonetheless, most of the states, and then the federal government with the eviction moratoriums, which was unconstitutional, it was issued not by the Congress, but by the CDC, for heaven's sakes. The point being, you were effectively put out of business because you still had to pay all the bills and the mortgage and so on and so forth. I think that's my biggest concern today, that if it's not the pandemic, it could be something else. And they've gotten away with it once. They may easily be able to get away with it a second time. I know there were some protests, but frankly, I think there were more protests that I read about in Europe than there were in the United States about some of the lockdowns that led to some of these small businesses having an extremely difficult time surviving. And there are going to be a lot of casualties, no question about it. Of course, in any recession, there are casualties among small businesses because typically they're undercapitalized. But this was closer to I guess a short-term depression, which was totally exacerbated by the federal and the state governments, and in many cases local governments too. So that would be one of my main concerns. If it's not the pandemic, it may be something else. Here's the other problem going forward. If we're going to raise taxes on income and on capital and perhaps on estates, taxes on carbon, which is going to make bringing goods into you, goods that you might sell, more expensive, I think that's going to be another roadblock in terms of starting a new business. I think we are moving toward a more statist model in the Western world. And that means, and I go back to what one of my early colleagues told me when I started in business in the 70s and 80s, and he said, Bob, you have to understand, you're a loose cannon, and therefore they do not like you, they being the government, because you can't be controlled as easily as somebody who works for a living, gets a W-2, you know, so on and so forth. And not that I was cheating on my taxes, but you know, it's a different kind of a story with the employee as opposed to the entrepreneur. So I think their goal is to bring as many people into the fold as possible that they can control. And this is not going to be good for the small business owner in most of the West. And I think the United States is going to be part of that. There may be some pushback. It may not be quite as bad as the rest of the Western world, although I'm not sure I'd be willing to take that bet. I think this is one of the things that you have to consider. I mean, look at the lockout last year, where some of the big box stores could sell certain goods, but a local store on Main Street in any town USA could not sell the same goods that were sold at a big box store. Remember that? So I think there's this movement toward big government, big labor, i.e. labor unions, big business, because it's a lot easier to corral them and have them a part of the regime, which we're seeing the big business kind of kowtowing to the government. It's easy for the government to direct them. They can directly threaten them. We're going to, well, maybe we could take your license or your charter away, or, oh, by the way, you won't get a bailout next time, or we'll ban stock buybacks, which, by the way, I don't think would be such a bad idea. And you know, on stock buybacks, by the way, what it tells me when companies buy back their own stock time and time again, it tells me they don't see any good investment opportunities, and that the best way to use their capital is to buy their own stock rather than going out and making acquisitions or doing R&D in their own business, that sort of thing. I think that that's kind of a negative for the economy. It's a negative sign that they can't find something that makes sense to buy, but oh well. So I think being small is going to be a problem. Now, if you're doing something that's internet-based, maybe you're just you know, giving advice to somebody, that sort of thing. In terms of starting a small business, that might be a little bit easier, but I still think the taxes could get in your way going forward. And all the things that I've covered in terms of, I think the governments want to bring as many people as possible under their direct control, and loose cannons, not so much. That would be my main concern about starting a business in the U.S. But if I was gung-ho, had a great idea, and I could outwork the competition, I don't think I'd let it stop me. But I think it's something you want to consider. The 80s and 90s were the halcyon days to start businesses in this country. Prior to that, 60s and 70s, not as much. Since then, it's getting more back to the 60s and 70s era. We're not in the 80s and 90s. I don't think we're going back to that anytime soon, but don't let me stop you. Just understand that I think it's going to be a more difficult journey, but it could be more fun. Well, thanks for stopping by. I'm Bob Henderson, the Nomad Dad for the Nomad Capitalist.